I recognize some familiar names in here, so thanks to those who are repeat visitors. For those who don't know me, I'm Paul Ligety. I'm the president of the Historical Society of West Windsor. Hopefully you're here for the lecture that explores the history of inns and taverns in West Windsor. I actually, and I'm serious about this, originally planned on wearing a tricorn hat, the three-sided hat, but unfortunately I left it in New Jersey. And at the double risk of disappointing you, if anyone's hoping I was going to be drinking throughout the lecture, the answer is no. But feel free to do it on your end. It seems like everyone's muted, so that's great. We are going to have a question and answer session at the end. So feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout. I'll be checking the chat. And, if there's a question that you just need to get answered in that moment, happy to do so. But otherwise, if you can keep yourselves muted, that would be great. And I would recommend that if you are going to ask questions and you do plan on drinking, ask the questions at the beginning while you can still understand the answers. So I'm going to start off with the same thing I usually start off with, which is a little bit of a unpaid promotion of the Historical Society itself. We are a 100% volunteer nonprofit. I'm sure many of you have been to the West Windsor History Museum, but for those who haven't, we do run a museum off at 50 Southfield Road. This is a minute down the road, a minute north of Grover Middle School, and right across the road from the Cranberry Golf Course. We also do a bunch of other things. We lead tours around town, like in local cemeteries or in local historic villages. We write regular newspaper articles. We have pretty active social media accounts, including Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. Some of you may have found out about the lecture there. We offer scholarships for students. We host a lot of community events. We undertake preservation projects and more. I'm going to do the usual, if you like what we're doing, just keep in mind that we can only do as much as our volunteer capacity allows us to do. So if you like what you're doing, consider helping out, consider giving back, and joining our volunteer team. We can't do what we do without volunteers. So next slide. There we go. This image is a little bit out of date. We actually published the book in 2022, but the West Windsor History book is still available. If you're interested in learning about local history from the Ice Age to the present day, we did publish a book a few years ago. It's 170 pages. So everyone except for dinosaur enthusiasts are going to get something that they want out of this book. Another thing that we've been doing in the past few years is installing local history markers. Here's one that's pictured in the Grover's Mill community. We have a number of others in historic villages. We recently installed one in one of the nation's earliest deliberately integrated neighborhoods in the entire United States, a place called Glen Acres off of Alexander Road. Just another example of something that we do is these markers to kind of help residents and passersby notice that, hey, there is actually history around us. So if you like what we're doing, please donate, please volunteer. I'm probably going to give the same spiel for the next two or three slides. Another big thing that we started undertaking recently is preserving what is possibly the oldest site in town, which is the Skank-Covenhoven Cemetery. This is located about 2,000 feet north of Washington Road and Route 1. It's not the one that's behind the Princeton Baptist Church. This is a different one that Princeton University has built a campus around. It dates to the 1730s, 1740s. There's about 80 to 100 burials, and a number of the people buried there are either West Windsor founders or early colonial settlers or Revolutionary War soldiers. And we're undertaking a big genealogy project in addition to restoring the actual cemetery physically, like the wall, and working with the university to care for the trees and restoring the actual physical gravestones, because it had been abandoned for generations. That's not quite true. The Princeton Baptist Church did take care of it for about 30 years before we did, but prior to them, it had been essentially abandoned for years, and there's still damage from that we're trying to restore. But again, we need your support. So again, if you're interested in volunteering or donating, once again, there's my pitch for that. Another thing I should mention is that this year, and I'm sure most, if not all of you know, this year's the 250th anniversary since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So the Historic Society last year organized a committee of a number of community groups. This includes the Arts Council, the Bicycle and Pedestrian Alliance, the township itself, actually, especially the Recreation Department, both fire companies, and a number of other groups, Lions Club, Farmers Market, to organize various events in celebration of the 250th. So there's about over two dozen this year that, includes what you see on the screen, parades, lectures such as this one, a time capsule burial is in the works. We have art shows, tours, museum events, and more. Each of them is going to have some kind of connection to the revolution, and you'll see the connection as I give the lecture tonight in terms of taverns. So if you're interested in learning more, again, I'll encourage you to visit our website. This is kind of a one-stop shop where you can, learn about local history, learn about upcoming events, learn how to volunteer and support us, and anything else West Windsor history. It really is kind of a one-stop shop, our website. So I think, and then here's our dedicated page. Again, we're all volunteers. So if you really do like what we're doing, please do consider giving back, because history does not preserve itself. And we have a variety of different opportunities. In fact, that the very last slide on this presentation, there's going to be a link to a volunteer orientation we're hosting on March 21st. So this upcoming Saturday, I believe, at the Princeton Junction Firehouse at 10 a.m. But again, I'll mention that at the very end. If you're interested in learning about volunteering, but kind of want to learn more about what we do, that's the opportunity for you. So a little bit, get kind of diving into the taverns and inns. I do want to provide a little bit of a broader context as to their general significance in West Windsor and colonial America in general. Some of this taverns that we're going to be talking about date back centuries. Some of them, including the first one I'm going to go into, the Hooper's Tavern from the 1760s, kind of come with colonial settlement in the area. Of course, West Windsor is not the only town that's had taverns. There's a bunch in Princeton, Trenton, Philadelphia. Basically, every town has had a tavern. In addition to providing food, drink, and lodging, they were places of social gatherings, of course, and political hubs as well. Many taverns functioned as places where people either debated politics or hosted political conventions, as we're going to learn about. Or taverns often functioned as public meeting spaces where essentially town halls as well, and West Windsor is no exception to this. And a lot of taverns were centered within local neighborhoods. Others were kind of more isolated, and we do have some examples of that as well. And some in West Windsor are long gone, but others still exist, including the very tavern in which our town's government was founded. There's another one that turned into a church more recently in West Windsor. And again, like I said, we're going to be exploring that in the ensuing slides. So starting off, I should point out, one of the ways that this lecture is structured is I'm going to be pointing out various historic neighborhoods in West Windsor. Edinburgh is one of them. And where you see these yellow circles with the kind of semi-transparent white inside, that's highlighting the taverns that I'm going to be talking about, where they are located in villages or local hamlets. So, for example, Edinburgh is one of them. This is a mid-1700s, probably 1750s, 1740s era community at the intersection of Edinburgh Road, Old Trenton Road, and Windsor Road. There are a number of other buildings in there too, including some houses. The village pantry, which, what we know as the village pantry today, was once a general store and a post office. It's West Windsor's oldest surviving and continuously operating storefront, dates to the 1810s. And the hotel itself is, interestingly enough, the third version of a hotel in Edinburgh. There were actually two before it. So the first version, and I apologize for using AI, but unfortunately, we don't really have an applicable image for Hooper's Tavern. So I do want to give a disclaimer that this one is AI. Was an inn that was located on Windsor Road, roughly where the, I believe it's the Goddard School, kind of little shopping office complexes off of Windsor Road, maybe a few hundred yards south of the intersection of Edinburgh and Windsor Road and Old Trenton Road. A man named Clement Hooper purchased a few hundred acres in the area in 1748, and his son Thomas established this as a public house by the year 1764. I say the word by, and it's important to notice those words because that is the earliest tavern license request that we know of, but it could have been older than that. This was near a route that had been chartered between Princeton and Allentown about 10 years prior. And Edinburgh was basically in the center of that route, connecting the villages of Princeton and Allentown. And as a result, it was an ideal location, and so was the tavern itself. The tavern was an ideal location to host town meetings. Now, at the time, West Windsor did not exist. West Windsor formed in 1797. Instead, we were part of a much larger township back in the mid 1700s called Windsor Township. The reason that we're called West Windsor is because when Windsor Township split in 1797, it split into an east half and a west half, which became East Windsor and West Windsor. So the name is pretty simple to understand why we are named West Windsor. Now, the Hooper family, especially Thomas Hooper, maintained this inn until the 1770s, but, and this is kind of where we get into the revolutionary aspect of this, unfortunately, the Hoopers did not have a happy tale. Because what happened is that the Hoopers were suspected of having British loyalties during the American Revolution. And a lot of people in the West Windsor area were the opposite. A lot of them were pro-independence. So kind of seeing the writing on the wall, Thomas Hooper went to Canada and the Prince Edward Island area that you can see in the top right of this image here, to scope out and survey a potential place to relocate his family. And that was not uncommon. A lot of British looked to Prince Edward Island and looked to Canada during the, sorry, not British, a lot of loyalists looked to Prince Edward Island and looked to Canada as a place to seek refuge, understanding that people who wanted independence were not exactly fans of loyalists. What was really sad and terrible was that while he was gone, his neighbors ransacked his house searching for him. These were people who had lived next to the Hoopers for decades. Again, his father had purchased land in the area in the 1740s, but they didn't find him. So instead, what they did, and I'm going to censor myself a little bit, is that they assaulted his wife, to put it very mildly. I'm sure that you can actually figure out what they really did with her, and left her in an outhouse to die, and she did. So after that point, Thomas Hooper took his family and fled, basically, to Canada, settled in Bedeque Bay and Prince Edward Island, and never returned. After he fled, and after his family fled, their land holdings were auctioned off. I believe it was in 1778 that they were auctioned off. I have to go back and check the exact date, and which was a pretty common practice to auction off the properties of British loyalists because they were considered, traitors to the colonial cause. And the inn was auctioned to a man named Martin Hoagland, who was a veteran in Washington's army. He was a captain in one of the militias, and he was one of 9. And in his I don't know the exact terminology, but in his immediate troop, only about 9 people of 45 survived within the Battle of Princeton. So there's an interesting and obviously very tragic tale there. Now, I do see a question in the chat going back to the Scankhovenhoven Cemetery. Sorry for being a little bit late on this one. Are the tombstones legible in the Scankhovenhoven Cemetery? A lot of them are, a lot of them are not. But luckily, there have been a variety of surveys taken since the 1880s, including one that we did in the last 5 years. And as a result, we know who's buried in about 90 or so percent of the graves there. There are about 10% where it's semi-unknown, or we have prevailing guesses, but we're not quite certain. But that is another thing that we were doing in addition to the genealogy and the restoration, is making sure that those who are buried there are actually remembered and documented. Now, after Hooper, his again, I mentioned that his land in Windsor Township is auctioned off. It goes to a guy named Martin Hoagland. It passes through a number of other owners until about 1806, when a man named Joseph Keeler also, and you can see in this map here, we have Windsor Road, Old Tretton Road, and Edinburgh Road. And this building here, where it says store, is the present day Village Pantry. So again, the tavern, Hooper's Tavern, originally was here. About 1806, a man named Joseph Keeler actually owns both properties. He owns Hooper's Tavern, and he owns the property at the corner over here at 1719 Old Tretton Road. Um, he effectively replaces Hooper's Old Tavern with a new hotel, the Edinburgh Hotel, at the intersection. And it operated for many years. It operated for decades for about 90 years, until it burned in 1895. And a third Edinburgh hotel was built in this place. And that's the hotel that anyone who knows about the Edinburgh Hotel and remembers it, the third one is the one that you're actually remembering. That's this building in this photograph here. During Prohibition, again, over the years, the hotel passes through many different owners, too numerous for me to really mention here. But one thing I should mention is that in 1924, and the 1920s in general, it did serve as a speakeasy. We'll see that as a theme as well. There were a number of speakeasies in West Windsor. For those who don't know what a speakeasy is, in the 1920s and early 1930s, it was a crime to serve alcohol during what was called the Prohibition-era. And there were a lot of quote unquote underground establishments that did it nonetheless, did it illegally because it was good business. And this was one of them. It was raided by agents in 1924 as an example. During the 1930s, the hotel was converted into a recreational hunting lodge. And in the 1950s, it was renovated to turn it from a hotel that provided lodging into just a tavern that still provided food and drinks, but did not provide lodging. So you can see in this picture here from 1962, you can see the hotel off to the right. I've labeled Edinburgh Road, Old Tretton Road, and Windsor Road. And where that Esso sign is, kind of in the center left, that's where the Village Pantry is today. So I think it should be, there we go. So that's another image of the Edinburgh Hotel. That's probably a lot more familiar to people who still live in West Windsor today. In the 1980s, it was fully converted into offices. So therefore, it's not a tavern anymore. And I believe there are apartments on top, but I'm not 100% certain, hence the question mark. So if anyone happens to know otherwise, feel free to put it in the chat. And it remains one of a few key landmarks in the historic community of Edinburgh, in addition to Village Pantry and in addition to a number of other houses from the 1800s and 1700s and early 1900s. So next we're going to go to another hamlet called Dutch Neck. This one's probably even more familiar to people. It's at the intersection of South Mill Road and Village Roads East and Village Road West. Where that circle is, you see D and Inn. That's the building we're talking about. But generally, Dutch Neck, again, is centered around Presbyterian Church. You have the Dutch Neck School, which is off screen, the West Windsor Volunteer Fire Company, an old chapel / library, which has long since been turned into a building owned by the West Windsor Plantsboro Board of Education, and about 36 houses that are older than a century. So there's a lot of concentration of existing and extant historical sites within the community. And it's roughly in the center of West Windsor. So the Dutch Neck Inn, to me, has one of the most, in my opinion, has one of the most interesting stories. This originally sat at the crossroads, directly at the crossroads of South Mill Road and Village Roads East and West. It was basically next to where the World War II memorial is. And I do see a question in the chat, how did you get these area photos with drone or Google Earth? It depends. Some of them do come from Google Earth. In this case, and in the case of Edinburgh, it was me personally taking a drone shot. So I took some of these about 4 or 5 years ago. So the Dutch Neck Inn opened around the 1780s, likely. Its first known owner was a man named Elijah Cook. in 1784. It sat across the road from what was known as the Neck Meeting House, located where the Dutch Neck Presbyterian Church sits today. So originally, the Dutch Neck Inn was right here. It's basically covered up by this label saying the Fred Cook House. The Dutch Neck Inn, passed to a man named John Voorhees in 1786 or 1787, but then a few years later to three men named Robert Hancock, William Shaw, and John Harper. And I believe it's the first two of those men, we'll see on the next slide, had a very interesting tale. And you probably saw in the ads for this lecture that there were some counterfeiters who had to deal with the inn in which our town's government formed, and this is the case. So Robert Hancock and William Shaw were part of a transatlantic counterfeiting ring in the 1790s. They, as well as I believe two or three others, were part of this ring, wherein Robert would travel to his home country of England and come back with English banknotes that they forged to mimic American currency. They kept this up for a few years until about 1794, when they were apprehended and charged in Lancaster in Pennsylvania. Ultimately, they were each sentenced to serve 15 to 16 years in prison, and that's where their story, as far as the research I've done currently, runs cold, although there could be more information out there. And they were also fined $300 each. For context, $300 would buy you a whole farm back then, so it was a pretty hefty sum. And in an unrelated note, the Dutch Neck Inn was also auctioned off the next year, including from John Harper, who was not part of the counterfeiting ring, but also from Robert Hancock and William Shaw, because they were in debt to a man named William Bell, who lived in Pennsylvania. So there's no evidence per se that the counterfeiting ever happened within the Dutch Neck Inn itself, but there's an interesting connection there. One thing I didn't include on this slide, but I'm just remembering, is that in the 1790s, the United States did not have the level of financial security that it's historically had in the last 100 years. Instead, in the 1790s, the nation is young. There's a lot of instability. There are recessions. There's issues with the financial system, so much so that the United States Continental Congress did have some pretty rigorous debates on making counterfeiting punishable by the death penalty. Ultimately, they did not, but it does give a sense of the severity of counterfeiting back then, and why 15 to 16 years, in some people's eyes back then, might have even been considered letting them off lightly. So either way, just an interesting story that we have associated with some owners of the Dutch Neck Inn. Now, I mentioned that in 1795, this inn is auctioned off, and the person who buys it, well, really one of the two people who buy it, is a man named Jacob Bergen. The other one's a man named John Story, but his tale is not as relevant to this. Now, Jacob Bergen was born in 1745 in present-day West Windsor. In the 1770s, he actually owns the very mill after which the community of Grover's Mill is named. And we're going to be talking about Grover's Mill later on in the lecture, so just keep that in the back of your mind. It was a sawmill and grist mill that was built in the mid-1700s, at least by the 1750s. And it still stands today, but it's not used as a mill anymore. It's apartments now, but the actual building still stands today. In 1777, Jacob Bergen was a lieutenant in the Somerset County Militia in Washington's army. So he was on the pro-independence side. And in that decade and the next decade, he ran a number of taverns. There were at least two in Princeton. One of them was called the College. Another one was called the Confederation. There was one in Trenton called the 13 Stars. And in Philadelphia, you have the Bunches of Grapes. Now, I do see a question, was Robert Hancock related at all to John Hancock? It's possible. I just haven't done that research yet. So unfortunately, I have to say I don't know at this very moment. But it is something that I do want to look into, even if briefly. But you can see, based off of the names that Jacob Bergen gave his inns and taverns, that he was very much pro-independence, and very much he themed his the names around that political persuasion. In fact, and he was relatively well connected politically. In the 1780s, Princetonians, because at the time Princeton was not an independent township, it was actually just a village located partially within Windsor Township. So at the time, they were considering seceding from Windsor and from the town on the other side that they also overlapped, which I believe was Montgomery, if I'm not mistaken. That they plan to use his inn as a meeting ground if their secession was successful, basically using it as the first town hall. Was West Windsor Princeton, and I'll answer that in a second. The secession didn't happen for quite some time. They didn't end up meeting in Jacob Bergen's Tavern, but another, evidence of him being well connected. We do have another question. What counties were in the 1770s? Was Windsor Princeton part of Somerset County at that point? Back then, Nassau Street and Stockton Street were part of what was known as the King's Highway. That was the division line between Middlesex County, which is what present-day West Windsor was in, and on the other side was Somerset County. Mercer County didn't form until 1838. So before then, everything in West Windsor, everything southeast of Nassau Street was in Middlesex County. In terms of Jacob Bergen in 1784, and this is probably the most interesting thing that I have about him, is that one of the taverns he owned in 1784 was called the French Arms. And it was at the time the biggest building in Trenton. It was this big brick building that you see portrayed here. And it served as the 9th Capitol building of the United States while Jacob was owning it. Because I believe it was from about October to December 1784, the United States Continental Congress met there. They hosted the Marquis de Lafayette, big French wartime hero from the Revolutionary War, shortly before he returned to France, and he wouldn't return for another 40 or so years. But Jacob Bergen owned the tavern at the time. Now, in the next decade, again, I mentioned in 1795, he purchases the Dutch Neck Inn, located at the crossroads. 2 years later, Windsor Township splits. Again, this is Old Windsor Township before West Windsor exists. But in 1797, on February 9th, 1797, Windsor Township splits into East Windsor and West Windsor. And the document that actually, the act of state legislature that split Windsor Township specifically said that West Windsor is going to start meeting at the tavern or at the inn owned by Jacob Bergen, which is this very building, the green building pictured in the center of this photograph. So they meet there starting on April 8th, 1797, where they elect the first government of West Windsor. There's about 23 men who are elected to a variety of positions. You have clerk, you have overseer of the highways, judge/moderator of elections, and a number of other positions that would be a little bit too lengthy to name them all. And thereafter, for the next 11 years, this is essentially West Windsor's first town hall. It's a private residence now, but I took this photo only a few years ago, and you can drive down the street and see if the building still stands. And after 1808, 11 years after that first meeting, the town committee moves around to various locations, but occasionally meets in this still as well. We do have a question. Do we know how Windsor got its name? Yes. At the time that Windsor Township formed in 1730, 1731, and then formally incorporated in the 1750s, we were obviously part of it. New Jersey was obviously a British colony. So the town of Windsor was an homage to the royal town of Windsor, England, where Windsor Castle is the royal, one of the royal seats. So it was named in honor of Windsor, England. So Jacob Bergen dies in 1805, after which his wife, Elizabeth Covenhoven, takes over. Some of you might know this building more as Widow Bergen's Tavern. It's colloquially called Widow Bergen's Tavern. The widow in Widow Bergen's Tavern is Elizabeth Covenhoven, and she operates it for many more years. Thereafter, it passes through a variety of different families. Another interesting thing about it is that in 1861, there is a local temperance movement which aims to shut it down. So usually what happens when someone wants to operate a tavern back then is they would submit a tavern license request to the county. In the 1860s, by that point, it was Mercer County, petitioning the county to allow them to use it as a tavern to serve alcohol. And usually you would get about a dozen people to vouch for you. They would add their signatures to the petition. But in 1861, there is about 3 dozen people who petition, who actually do a counter petition against the tavern, renewing its license. And in response, the tavern owner at the time, a man named Enoch Hart, gets, rather than getting a dozen, he gets about 120 people so about 10 dozen people to sign for him. So there was a bit of a local dispute there. He ultimately does get the right to keep operating as a tavern, but it does shut down in around 1879. So in the next decade, it shuts down around 1879, 1880, because after he passes away, there's an inheritance dispute amongst his children, and there's disagreements on what to do with it. So it's ultimately sold to someone else, and thereafter becomes a residence. In the 1920s, 1930s, when this dead-end portion of South Mill Road is constructed, that's when the tavern is moved from the intersection, where I'm moving my cursor around here, about 300 feet south to its current location at 212, 214 South Mill Road. So now that was a little bit of a mouthful on the Dutch Neck Inn. I'm going to go to another village, another hamlet, which doesn't exist anymore, but I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, recognize the name Clarksville, if nothing else because of the term Clarksville Road, is one of the big roads that runs through the township. It's an older name than the road itself. The Clark family settled in the Princeton area in the 1690s, closer to the Stony Brook area, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But what's interesting here is that there is a village called Clarksville at the intersection of Rat Run and Quaker Bridge Road. There was a blacksmith. There was an inn, as I'm going to talk about, a variety of different farms. And this is an image taken from our website. We have the old American Cyanamid track. George Washington literally marched through town along Quaker Bridge Road on January 3rd, 1777 during the American Revolution. And I can give a whole big lecture about that as well. But that's not the purpose of this lecture. So we have Windsor Hall here. Now, Windsor Hall itself also has an interesting story. As I mentioned, it stood at the very intersection of Route 1 and Quaker Bridge Road on the West Windsor side, because Quaker Bridge Road separates West Windsor Township and Lawrence Township. And it was on the north. This is not actually oriented to north. So it was on the east corner of Quaker Bridge Road and Route 1. Now, it was opened around 1800 to 1810 by a doctor named Israel Clark. Israel Clark is of the same family as the Clark family in Princeton, the same as the Thomas Clark House at the Princeton battlefield, or the William Clark House, which no longer exists. That's because in the 1690s, one of their ancestors named Benjamin Clark, purchased about 1,200 acres overlapping both Princeton and West Windsor. And the portion in which Windsor Hall was built was ultimately part of that same familial tract dating back to the 1690s. Now Israel was a prominent local doctor. He owned a lot of land locally as a result of being part of that big landowning family. And again, he opened this tavern in the early 1800s. But I do not believe that he personally ran it. Instead, he rented it out to a variety of different innkeepers. Again, a little bit too numerous to name here. What's interesting is that in the 1830s and 1840s, it served as a sort of political gathering place where the Mercer County Whigs would host meetings. And in the 1870s to the 1890s, it was the go-to place for West Windsor Township to host its meetings. So similar to the Dutch Neck Inn, similar to other inns that we're going to be talking about, it was a very popular thing for West Windsor. Almost exclusively hosted its meetings in inns and taverns from the time that it was founded until the time that it built a dedicated town hall in the 1910s.
Wow.
People joke, we can gather around and make political discourse over beer and over food, and that's what they did back then. In the 1920s, just like the Edinburgh Hotel, this was also a speakeasy during Prohibition, and it was also raided by federal agents in 1924. And then the next decade, it was demolished as Route 1, which is in this. This is a little bit less of an AI. It is still as AI interpretation, but what I did is I took an old photograph and it was very poor quality, and I semi-restored it with AI. So this road right here is Route 1, as it would have existed in the early 1900s. Back then, it was a dirt road. It was not the 4 or 5 or 6 lane highway that we know today. Another village that we have in West Windsor is Penn's Neck. Some of you might live there. I know that at least one of you is very active in the Princeton Baptist Church there. There are actually 3 inns/taverns that I'm going to be talking about. One of them is Guyberson's Tavern. Well, the first one I'm going to be talking about is the Red Lion Inn. It's right next to the Princeton Baptist Church property, very close to the intersection of Washington Road and Route 1. Another one is Guyberson's Tavern, which is going to be the tavern after that. And the third one is the Bearbrook Tavern, which is now the Princeton Korean Community Church. Penn's Neck as a community was first settled by colonists around the 1730s, but then in the very early 1800s, after Route 1 was charted in 1804, it started clustering around the intersection of Route 1 and Washington Road. And a lot of the area around Route 1, a lot of the farmland is gone, but there is still a neighborhood, a residential zone east of Route 1, kind of bisected by Washington Road, which is the area that I'm kind of circling around with my cursor right now. Now, the Red Lion Inn, again, the building in this middle circle here at the intersection of Route 1 and Washington Road, was built around the crossroads in 1807. And that's a pretty common thing, a theme that inns and taverns would be built at crossroads, of course, because it's a place where travelers who might be tired after a long day could grab some food, could grab some drink, and if they needed to, grab some rest for the night. Its first known owner was, not first known owner, its first known innkeeper was a man named John Jolene, who within a year was succeeded by someone else named George Follett, who, like Jolene, owned a variety of taverns in the Princeton area. And Follett himself was known for hanging a symbol of a red lion. They say here that it's signed, but it's a sign with a symbol of a red lion outside of his inns. Hence the belief that that back then, even back then, it was called the Red Lion Inn. Now, I mentioned previously that the Dutch Neck Inn was our first town hall from 1797 until 1808 continuously, and that after that point it jumped around to a variety of different taverns. It jumped around to a variety of different inns, and I'd mentioned the Clarksville Inn, Windsor Hall was one of them. The Penn's Neck Inn, the Red Lion Inn, was another one of them, starting in 1808. In 1819, it was sold to a man named Asher Temple, who also sponsored horse racing in the area, which was a lot of his neighbors were not a fan of it, but he personally did, obviously profited off of it, and so much so that he actually rebranded the inn as the White Horse, or White Horse Inn, White Horse Tavern. I'm not sure if it has any connection to, I believe it's in Hamilton that you have, White Horse Road, but there might be some connection there. So let me, there we go. Next slide. So over the years, the Red Lion Inn passes through a variety of different innkeepers until a man named Noah Reed shuttered it in the 1870s, which to the Princeton Baptist Church right next door was a big relief at the time. I believe the pastor at the time, there was a quote that he said that either the church is going to go or the inn's going to go. And then after it turns out that the inn went, I like this quote: "The next best thing that the church has ever done, next to the erection of the church, was actually purchasing the ring in 1797. So let's see. Next slide. So, sorry, not 1797, in 1879. 50 years later, they relocated the inn about 150 feet southeast to its present location, because originally, let me go back a few slides. Originally, the inn was located directly at the crossroads. If you look at the circle here, the inn would have kind of been closer to here, where I'm moving my cursor around. And then in 1929, they relocated it about 150 feet this way to the
Listening.
west. Sorry, to the southeast. Um, Partly due to Route 1 being widened. So let me go back. So 1929, that relocation happens. In 1989, so 6 years later, it's put on the National Register of Historic Places, in large part because of its fireplaces. Apparently, it had very interesting fireplaces. One thing, I'm sorry, there might be someone here who's not muted. I would ask that you mute yourselves because so it doesn't interrupt the presentation. And then in 2022 or so, it was reconfigured into a home for single mothers. Now the inn, it's obviously gone through a variety of different uses, but it still stands as one of Penznick's oldest and most historic extant sites. Oh, sorry, I do realize that we have a question. Is the inn the white building or the other? If you're talking about this image, the Red Lion Inn is this building in the front, and Guyberson's Tavern, which is the next inn that we're going to be talking about, is this building right behind it. And in between the two, you have Route 1. This image dates to about the 1890s or earlier. Yeah. So next one, as I mentioned, was Guyberson's Tavern. This also stood at the Washington Road and Route 1 traffic circle. It was possibly built in the early 1800s. We don't have a lot of evidence one way or the other because it was demolished possibly over a century ago. So we don't have really good and that very much knowledge about it. But what we do know is that in the 1820s, a man named Gilbert Guyberson operated it as a tavern. And then there were a variety of other innkeepers from the 1830s to 1840s. A man named David Voorhees, a blacksmith, purchased it, I believe in 1843 specifically, and converted it into a house. And he had a blacksmith shop off to the right, off screen from what the photograph shows. Another thing that I found interesting was that supposedly it was split in half in the late 1800s or early 1900s. And at least one of the halves, if not both, were moved to this is South Harrison Street. I realize it should say Lower Harrison Street in West Windsor. In 1955, this gas/service station was built, obviously in much better shape in 1955 than it is today, at the Penznick traffic circle. For context, this turnoff, we have Route 1 here. This is where it turns off to Washington Road as you're going towards Princeton. So in 1955, a man named Kenneth Logan builds a golf service station at the intersection on the site of where the inn used to be. And in the 2010s, so about 10, 15 years ago, it goes out of service. There is a question, what was Route 1 called before it was Route 1? Now, Route 1 is more of the route that kind of stretches, I believe, from Florida, or maybe it's not Florida to Maine, but it crosses more than just New Jersey. But this stretch of Route 1 that passes through West Windsor that was charted in 1804 was originally called the Trenton-New Brunswick Straight Turnpike. Reason being that it was a road that was straight that connected Trenton to New Brunswick. So sometimes you might hear the name Brunswick Pike, which is a shortening, which is kind of used today as well. That is a shortening of Trenton to New Brunswick Turnpike. So, and then we come upon our last inn/tavern in West Windsor, which is the Bearbrook Tavern. Some of you might recognize this building. If you don't, you might recognize the Princeton Tennis Center, what was formerly a big red metal building. Now it's, I think, a sky blue building off of Washington Road, right next to the Bearbrook, a little bit past where the railroad bridge goes over the railroad and meets Washington Road. This building is across the road from the tennis center. It was opened in 1933 as a tavern by a man named Stephen Anderson, and it passed through a variety of different people, but ultimately to John Ellsworth and Jack Stives in 1963. You can see one of their ads here, one of the early, I believe it's a 1930s era ad, advertising delicious sandwiches, a musical act, a sociable crowd. in 1967, the American Legion, the local American Legion, Post 76, turned it into their headquarters. And about 25 years ago, it was purchased by the Princeton Korean Community Church, which has used it ever since as a church. But again, its original use was as a tavern. Another community in West Windsor, and you're going to get sick of me talking about these communities, is one called Port Mercer. Some of you might know about it, some of you might not. It is an 1830s era a community within West Windsor. And before I keep going on that, we do have a question: who was John Ellsworth? Were the street in the center named after him or his family? I don't know too much about John Ellsworth personally as a person. In terms of the center named after him or his family, um, the Ellsworth Center came in the 1950s, I believe. I forget which member of the Ellsworth family actually did construct it. I know it's owned or was owned until recently by a man named Sean Ellsworth. But yes, the Ellsworth Center is ultimately named after the Ellsworth family. Whether or not John Ellsworth was of that very specific family, probably, but I don't know for certain, unfortunately. Same thing for the street as well. So Port Mercer is an 1830s era community that overlaps West Windsor and Lawrence townships, as well as Princeton to a little bit. It's at the intersection of Quaker Bridge Road and the Delaware and Raritan Canal, and Quaker Road as well. Off the screen and further above where this image shows, you have NASA Park Pavilion, where you have Home Depot, you have until a few years ago Walmart and a number of other stores, obviously. And the Port Mercer Inn is in the center of this community. The Port Mercer Inn, just like the Princeton Basin Hotel, which I'm going to be talking about in a few slides from now, served both canal workers and locals alike. This one was probably built around the 1840s or 1850s by a man named John Crater, who owned a number of other pieces of property in the area. In the 1860s, it was rented to a man named William West, who used it as, again, this term public house is a pretty common use. They were known to have served very salty turtle soup, which incentivized people who visited to also purchase copious amounts of beer. It was probably somewhat of a business strategy, and there was a dance hall upstairs. Now, the next bullet point, I do want to disclaim that this is hearsay, but there used to be someone, or I don't know if he still lives in the area, named Gordon Keith, who is basically the unofficial historian of the community back in the 1990s, who had made a claim that the inn might have also served as a brothel back in the 1800s. But again, this could be hearsay. But still an interesting thing that I've at least heard, even if it's not necessarily true. Again, we were still doing digging into that. We don't know when it stopped being used as a hotel, but as you can see from the picture that I took last year, it still stands as a private residence. Next one, similar to Port Mercer, was a community called Princeton Basin. It is at the intersection of Alexander Road and the Delaware and Raritan Canal. Just like Port Mercer, it thrived because of canal traffic. Back in the 1800s, the canal was constructed and opened in the 1830s as a commercial artery. There was a lot of commodities that were shipped. And both Port Mercer and Princeton Basin had what were called turning basins. And you might actually recognize Turning Basin State Park, or the canoe launch here, this little pond here, which are basically little ponds where boats and barges could moor for the night and offload and unload cargo. So just like the Port Mercer Hotel, the Princeton Basin Hotel was near to where one of the bridges crossed over the canal. In this case, it was Alexander Road. And in this case, the hotel was probably constructed in the 1830s or 1840s, and it served canal workers and travelers alike. It was also over the years called the Railroad Hotel and the Steamboat Hotel. One interesting thing, and the first known owner was a man named John Skillman. Now, one interesting thing about Princeton Basin was that back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, although its heyday was in the mid 1800s, by the late 1800s, it had actually become one of the seediest neighborhoods in the Princeton and West Windsor area. There were about a dozen murders over the course of 15 years in the late 1800s, between the 1880s and the early 1900s. And this hotel was unfortunately not an exception. One of the more well-known murders was in 1874. There was a Princeton jeweler named Solomon Krauskopf who took a train to Trenton in that year. I believe it was in March, to do some business in Trenton. And on the way back, heading north after he was done in Trenton, he was heading back to Princeton Junction, but I believe he fell asleep and missed the stop. So he woke up in New Brunswick. So he took a train back, somehow missed the stop again. And finally, when he ended up finally getting into Princeton Junction, by that point, it was so late that he actually had to walk back to his house in Princeton, because the dinky, which did exist at the time, was not running that late. So as he was walking back, at some point when he crossed over the canal from West Windsor into Princeton, because the canal is the border between West Windsor and Princeton, at some point he was murdered. It seems that to have been a robbery. There was a good amount of money that was stolen from him. He was shot, and the next day his body was found lying next to the canal. Now, one of these suspects, the murder was never solved. And I'm personally digging into it myself to see if I can find out more information about it. But the murder was never solved. And one of the suspects was actually the owner and the operator of the Princeton Basin Hotel, a man named John Corliss. Now, he was suspected, but he was never formally charged. But the rumor stuck around for a while. And in 1881, there was an obituary that was published in the Asbury Park Press, because he lived around the Asbury Park area about that point, claiming that he had died, and he had not. But the obituary claimed that he had died, and it also claimed that he was the murderer of Solomon Krauskopf. And because he was actually still very much alive at the time, he responded with a newspaper article of his own condemning the obituary and condemning people who claimed that he was the murderer. So again, it remains unsolved to this day. Another murder that took place in the hotel was a man named John Larkins, who was white, who killed a black man named Samuel Cruzen. And I mentioned the races because if you look at the newspaper articles back then that report on it, they really play up the racial aspect of this, and it was a major news story, at least in that year, locally in Princeton. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, he killed, I believe it was a drunken bar fight that ended up with John Larkins shooting him. In the 1920s and 1930s, the building was remodeled from a hotel, which provides accommodations, into a tavern, which just provides food and drink. And in the 1942, the last murder in the building took place when a man named Theodore Proctor killed his wife, Mary, jumped into the canal, and drowned. So not exactly a happy place to live, a happy place to do business. Princeton Basin, again, there are a number of murders in that area. It has since become, it's more of a residential area now. It's a much better place to live now. But back in the early 1900s, it was not so great. In 1948, so 6 years after the Proctor murder, it was inherited by a relative named Della Jenkins, who was a school teacher. And she was, among other things, known from walking to town hall. So basically walking from this area to the Dutch Neck area on foot to pay taxes. So she must have been in pretty good shape. But after she passed away, the building was demolished in 1992, because by that point it had become very dilapidated and structurally unsound. Another community that we're going to talk about is Grover's Mill, which most, if not all of you, have heard of. If nothing else, then from the War of the Worlds broadcast, which is not really part of this presentation, but I'll mention it nonetheless. Grover's Mill is located at Clarksville Road, Cranberry Road, and Millstone Road. Most, if not all of you, know the Grover's Mill Pond. The actual mill after which it was named, is right here at 164, I believe it's 164 Cranberry Road. This is the one that I mentioned that several slides back, that Jacob Bergen, again, that Revolutionary War soldier who owned the Dutch Neck Inn, he also owned the mill in the 1770s. However, that's not the point of this lecture. Instead, this slide, I want to highlight a building called Lady Fair, which is one of West Windsor's oldest houses. Now, Lady Fair, it's located at 429 Clarksville Road. Again, if you look at back at the aerial image here, it's right around here. And Rogers Preserve, which some of you might hike through, the entrance off of Clarksville Road is right in front of Lady Fair, the house. It was built by the 1750s, if not earlier. The oldest record we have of it is well, tax records claim it was built in 1758, but there is a decent chance that it was the original millwright's house before another one succeeded it in the 1770s. Now, in that same decade, in 1779, it was purchased by a man named Nicholas Height, who is of the same family as the Heights in Heightstown. We do have a record of Nicholas Height operating a tavern and an inn, really, actually, at the time. But we do not know if it was this building or another one, which is why I say the word possibly. One of the legends about this building, and it could very well be apocryphal, we don't know if it's true, and I don't have any evidence for it, but what I've heard, at least hearsay, is that the Marquis de Lafayette slept in the building and Ehrenberg carved his name in a cupboard. Again, this could be equivalent to every other house from the 1700s claiming that Washington slept there. But because I can't prove it or disprove it, I'll say it's unlikely, but technically possible. But I still think it's unlikely. In any case, it passed through a variety of different families over the generations. It came into the hand of the Rogers family in the 1930s or 40s, and they lived there until the 1980s. And yes, this is the same family after whom the Rogers Preserve is named, because Rogers Preserve was built on the site of a Christmas tree farm operated by a local conservationist named Ron Rogers, who was also the founder of another local nonprofit called the Friends of West Windsor Open Space. And Ron Rogers is also the man after whom Rogers Arboretum, the field across the road from High School South, was named. Before then, it was known as the Coward Tract. Now, you see the house here looks a lot more modern. I should have included a more vintage photo of the building, but not the current owners, but I believe the owners before them removed most of the historic exterior detailing in the 2010s. But if you do see this building, this is Lady Fair, and structurally it does date to the 1750s, if not earlier. And we're coming close to the end of the lectures, but before I get to that, well, I do want to talk a little bit about Princeton Junction, which every one of you should probably knows. It is a 1860s era community that grew around the Princeton Junction train station. The reason it's called Princeton Junction is because it's located at the junction or intersection of the Northeast Corridor main line right here and the Dinky line that leads into Princeton, hence Princeton Junction. In addition to a variety of other businesses like a general store and post office, like a feed mill for local farms, like a variety of different houses, there was also a saloon owned by a man named Owen Sheridan, which I'll show on the next page. Now, this building doesn't exist anymore, but it was located a few properties down from Dewey's Upholstery Shop, which does still exist. So let me go back to the previous slide. So it would have been located right here, where right now there's a parking lot, but roughly across the road from the Wallace Road parking lot. And again, a few houses down from Dewey's Upholstery Shop and the recently closed Asian Bistro at the intersection of Station Drive and Washington Road. Now, the Princeton Junction Saloon was built around the 1860s and 70s by a man named Owen Sheridan. It likely served locals as well as railroad workers. You can imagine if you've been working a long day, maybe you want to, kick your feet up, get a drink, get some food. And there's some evidence it also functioned as a store at the same time. Now, in 1903, a man named William Mahan purchases the property. This is also a not exactly a happy story. he actually lost his liquor license, but surprisingly, there was no other sentencing for him after a 17-year-old boy named Andrew, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the last name, but I'm going to attempt it and say Shipe, was found dead, not on, but next to the railroad tracks one cold winter evening. I believe the year was 1912. After it was found that he had William Mahan had served him alcohol, but apparently all he got was the loss of his liquor license and nothing else. In either case, the saloon kept operating for a number more years. In the year 1930, it was again raided by prohibition agents. Again, you see this common theme of various inns and taverns serving as speakeasies during the Prohibition era. And we don't know what happens after that. And that's kind of where the trail runs cold, at least as far as the sources we found so far. But it was demolished in the mid 1900s. And again, if you look at this image here, you might be able to see that nowadays it's basically just a parking lot, and it's been a parking lot for decades. I believe that at the time it was demolished, it was not in great shape. Another one, this is I believe the third to last slide, was a property serving liquor. Sorry, I'm also reading the chat at the same time. This is our third to last slide. Now the chat, I do see a question, how far back did New Jersey have laws against serving liquor to minors? A very good question. I actually do not know, unfortunately, but that is going to prompt me to search that, because that's, I don't know exactly what age, the drinking age became the drinking age, whether or not it's changed over time. And if there was the establishment of a drinking age at some point, as opposed to it always existing. So good question, but I'm sorry to say I don't actually know the answer to it. So in 1912, at 1912 Old Trenton Road, there is a house that we believe, again, this is not a certainty, but it seems very likely served as a inn or / tavern in the early 1800s. Now you can see on the sign here, a Jewel Farmstead, private residence, says 1768. This house is behind Grover Middle School. It's across the road from Village Grand, to give a kind of sense of context as to where it is. If you drive down Old Trenton Road, you're going to see the sign. It kind of sticks out right next to Old Trenton Road. And it was built in the 1760s by a man named William Jewell. It was about a 200-acre farm. His son, William Jr., held a variety of different township positions from the late 1700s until the 1830s. He was a constable, he was a judge of elections, he was a surveyor of highways, overseer of the highways, and I think there are one or two others as well that I didn't put on here for the sake of brevity. Another thing interesting about William Jr. is that we have tavern licenses for him from the year 1826 to from 1806 to 1826 that shows him operating a tavern along Old Trenton Road. Now he did own a few other properties in the area, but this one seems to be the very most likely one, because this house is of the right age, and this is the one that is directly on Old Trenton Road as opposed to just nearby. And I mention that because the tavern licenses do specifically reference Old Trenton Road, albeit by a different name. So the house stays in the Jewell family for about 150 years until the 1920s. And now the farmland eventually disappears, and suburbs were built over it, plus Grover Middle School decades ago. But the house itself remains, and again, very likely was originally a tavern. Now here in the penultimate slide, I do want to mention something, and this presentation would be way too long if I were to go into every single tavern that possibly existed in West Windsor. The reason being that we have a folder, and we've collected scans and from the New Jersey State Archives. I personally collected these scans we have about 60 different tavern folders with tavern licenses. What I mean by that is we have a list of at least 60 tavern keepers / tavern owners. Some of them might have been tavern owners for the same tavern, the same building, that two people might have owned at different periods in time. But what it seems to imply is that there were dozens of taverns in West Windsor in the 1700s and 1800s. Obviously, all the ones that have explored nowadays don't serve as taverns anymore. Some of them, like Iverson's Tavern, don't exist anymore. Some of them, like the Bearbrook Tavern or the Dutch Neck Inn, were converted into a church or a residence, respectively. But we do have a few modern taverns as well, by the definition of an establishment that serves liquor and serves food, especially along Route 1. We have, Tommy's Tavern, Brickcast Tavern, both near the Market Fair area. And there might be a few others as well. So, you can drive around, find these old, the current taverns yourself, enjoy them, or you can, try driving around, find the Dutch Neck Inn, find the Breadline Inn. If you still need directions as to where they are, feel free to email us. But that's the lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. One thing I do want to end off with is that, again, we have a volunteer orientation in case you're interested in being part of our team on March 21st, so this Saturday at 10 a.m. at the Princeton Junction Firehouse. You can sign up here. If you have not yet gotten the West Windsor history book, you can get the book here. And if you have any other questions, you can either put them in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourselves, but I'll keep myself available for the next few minutes unless there don't happen to be any other questions. Yes, I do see thank you very much for the compliments. I do see a question about breweries in the area. There is only one that I personally know of that you could consider a brewery. It was along Old Trenton Road. Roughly across the road from Mercer County Park, roughly across the road from where Paxson Avenue, or the main road running through Mercer County Park, intersects Old Trenton Road, there was an old cider mill, or not cider mill, there was an old cider distillery that was run by a man named Amos Tyndall, Amos or Amos Tyndall, in the 1860s, and he made a product called Applejack, which is basically an alcoholic cider. Other than that, any breweries specifically within West Windsor, I do not personally know of. There might have been some, but if they were few and far between or limited in their years of operation. Let's see if there's any other questions. Yeah, thank you all very much for the enthusiasm. Aside from Widow Bergen, were there any other women tavern owners in West Windsor? That's a very good question. And did Ron Rogers live at Lady Fair? Going to other women tavern owners, Elizabeth Covenhoven, who is the Widow Bergen, is the only one that I personally know of off the top of my head. The reason I say off the top of my head is because throughout this presentation, I've been saying, there are a variety of different tavern owners over the year, and then this happened. And then there were a variety of owners, and this happened. That's because for a lot of these taverns, there were dozens upon dozens of tavern keepers, tavern owners. So there's actually, I have a feeling that there were other women tavern owners that I'm not remembering off the top of my head. But Miles, I'll shoot you an email with that information, because that is a question I should keep in mind for the next time I do this presentation. There's a question. Yeah, hi, John.
This is John Rader.
Yes.
We were mentioning about cider, reminded me we used to go to a place called Shelky's in West Windsor up on Cranberry Road to get cider.
Yes.
And somebody asked whether Ron Rogers lived at Lady Fair, and the answer is yes, because I was a fellow environmental commissioner of his, and I knew that's where he lived.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I mentioned the Christmas tree farm too. He operated the Christmas tree farm. That's not the Rogers Preserve. Yeah, and someone included a comment saying some of the buildings, you remember some of the buildings that are long gone. Yeah, there's been a lot of, I'm too young to personally remember it. I moved here by the time West Windsor suburbanized. I'm 32 years old for context. But from everything I've seen, talking to people, looking at old aerials, yeah, the area's changed a lot. There's a lot that's come and gone. But you might be surprised. Again, I mentioned that our website is kind of a one-stop shop, and that includes learning about local history. We have a list on our website what we call our 100 Club, which is a list and a map, although it needs to be updated, of sites in town that are older than 100 years old, or that we believe, based on prevailing evidence, are older than 100 years old. And there's about 225 of them. So there's more than you might think. The problem being that a lot of them are scattered around town. They're kind of isolated, so you kind of have to know where to look. But a lot of the historic sites are still there. A lot of them are not, but a lot are still there. And what we're trying to do is give more recognition to them and kind of encourage the owners of these properties to keep them preserved. So hopefully that ends up being accomplished. On a different topic, do you know how anything about the history of the abandoned and dilapidated buildings across the street from McCaffrey's? Only a little bit. Those houses generally were built in the 1930s to the 1950s. They don't have any. I hate being the one to delineate what defines historic and what not, because I'm just one person. But in my personal opinion, none of these buildings that are on that triangle between McGettrick Lane, Southfield Road, and Princeton Hatstrand Road have any historic importance. They're not old enough, and they've been abandoned for decades. So they were only lived in for a few decades each. There did used to be a building there, and this is where McGettrick Lane gets its name. There did used to be a building at the corner of McGettrick and Southfield that was owned by, from the 1860s, that was owned by a Civil War veteran named Patrick McGettrick and his family for decades. But that too was abandoned by the 1990s, fell into extreme disrepair, and about 5 or 6 years ago was torn down, unfortunately. Yeah, someone mentioned Triumph Brewery. Yeah, that's the thing. If I'm talking about taverns in the Princeton area, this would turn into a 10-hour lecture. Luckily, I have to deal with the West Windsor area. So, but yes, you're right. There was Triumph Brewery, relocated to the old post office in Princeton. There's always Yankee Doodle Tap Room. I'm sure there's plenty of others in the Princeton area. Were there any other inns and taverns off of North Harrison Street in the Aqueduct area? Not that I know of. The one that I mentioned where Guyberson's Tavern that was split in half and relocated to to Lower Harrison Street. I do not particularly know which house it would have been. I don't know if it's one of the current houses or if it was an older house that has long since been torn down. In terms of a tavern, I'm trying to remember, because there and still are a number of buildings off of Mapleton Road on the Plainsboro side of the Aqueduct community, but off the top of my head, I don't believe any of those were taverns. And how old is the bog? Good question. Now the golf course itself dates to the 1960s. I believe it was the 1964-65 when the golf course opened. I actually don't know when the bog itself in the golf course. For those who don't know, there's a sort of tavern slash cafe in the. They have a wide variety of drink selections in the Cranberry Golf Course. John, since I know you're on, do you happen to remember when the bog opened?
No, because I wasn't that well acquainted with that part of West Windsor at the time.
Okay. But that is a good question too. And I should mention, yeah, that's another one of West Windsor's taverns. Again, they have a very big drink selection, and I think it's rotating. So it's a good place to host events and get a drink if you want.
I go back to 62 as a grad student, 73 as a resident.
Another thing about the Cranberry Golf Course, this is going off on a little tangent though, is that before it was the Cranberry Golf Course, it was farmland. And there is a house in the middle of the Cranberry Golf Course. It's used, I believe, as offices now, but that building, that house was once a farmhouse. It dates to the 1830s or possibly earlier. And in the 1830s, it was owned by a Revolutionary War veteran named Clement Updike. So that's one of the few houses that still exist in town that was once the home of a Revolutionary War veteran as well. Okay. I'm trying to see if I missed any questions. And again, thank you very much to everyone for the kind words and the encouragement. We are going to have more lectures, of course, throughout the year. One about slavery. We're going to have one about comparing American and Indian India independence / Pakistani / Bangladesh one on Native Americans. So we'll have a variety throughout the year. And thank you very much. And yes, we are saving the recording. We're going to be posting this to YouTube tonight. So you'll be getting an email from me depending on when it actually formally uploads to YouTube. When it's ready for public presentation, you might get an email from me at like 2 a.m. or something. Saying, oh, by the way, the recording's available. But yes, we'll be uploading it in the next few hours. Okay. All right. Seeing no other questions, I want to say thank you all very much for coming. Appreciate your time.